All right, welcome back to another C2 video. In this one, we're going to be covering Havoc C2, which is an open source command and control framework created by C-Spider, or I guess Crack Spider here as he goes by. And now this guy, he actually created this, I believe, as a way to learn more about C2s, which is something I would highly recommend you guys to do, even if you don't create the next Cobalt strike. Just the act of trying to create something similar, even if it's not necessarily this advanced, right, is going to be a very good learning process just across the board. And as you're learning this stuff and leveling up, eventually you're going to come to the point where you're ready to start applying to jobs. In that case, you're definitely going to want to arm yourself with the top 10 pen testing interview questions you need to know. I have that for you down in the description below. So let's just dive right into it. This framework has been getting quite a bit of buzz on the internet lately. I thought I would cover it. And the cool thing about it, as you guys that are familiar with Cobalt Strike will be able to tell, this thing is pretty much identical in the look and feel of Cobalt Strike. So if you're one of those people where you wanted to get your hands on Cobalt Strike, but you're not able to because it is super expensive, I would not recommend buying it. I would recommend if you can get it through your employer, if you're a red teamer or something like that, that would be the way to go. But in the meantime, if you don't have access to Cobalt Strike, I would definitely check out. I would recommend checking this out anyways, because I think it is pretty cool. Now, one thing to know about this is that, as it says here, it is in an early state of release. Now, while we are going through this stuff, we're going to be using the wiki page for the installation instructions, which are really nice and thorough here. We can keep looking at this GitHub page, but let's get these commands running. There's a lot of stuff that we have to download and kind of wait on anyhow. So the very first thing I'm going to do is to clone the repository, and we'll dive into the op directory to do that. I'll run a git clone, make this larger for you guys, and we'll just pull it down. Oops, here we go. We'll go into Havoc. Right. So in Havoc, we have a couple folders that are going to be important for us. One is the team server folder. The other is the client, because this is very much like your traditional C2 framework in the fact that, you have a team server, which is like your back-end server, and then you have the client, which is your front end. So we're going to need to build both of these things, and it doesn't really matter which order we build them in. I'm just going to go in and start working on the team server first. But before I build anything, there's a number of dependencies that I'm going to need. Now, before I run this command here that has all these dependencies, where is it? In the wiki right here. Before I run this, I'm actually going to make sure that my repositories are up to date, because I found that if you don't do this, then usually a lot of the things fail, and then you have to go back and run another apt-get update. So we're just going to make sure everything is up to date beforehand. And then once this finishes updating, then we can run that command that's going to install 1.5 million dependencies. The most difficult part of this is just getting all the dependencies set up. Once you do, it's pretty straightforward to use this thing. All right, that is done. So now I'll paste in this command here and install all this stuff. Now, this is going to take, obviously, a minute here, and it will prompt me once or twice. I'm just going to accept the defaults. Now, while that's going, we can take a look back at the documentation, and as you'll see here soon, it is very similar to Cobalt Strike in the look and feel, but like I was saying earlier, it is not fully fleshed out yet. They're still developing this and adding more stuff to it. So, for example, one of the limitations that comes to mind is you can only run this, the team server listener, over HTTP and HTTPS. There's no support for, like, say, DNS quite yet. Another thing that's pretty interesting is the sleep obfuscation. So the same creator, C-Spider, he created this tool here, Echo. And I guess it's based off the League of Legends champion Echo. And it's a small sleep obfuscation technique that uses the create timer queue timer Win32 API. So what this allows you to do is obfuscate the sleep, right? So if you use the default way there is no obfuscation applied. So there's certain things that, little add-ons and things you can use that can help make this even better. And as well, in the wiki, there's a ton of stuff. Let me just check back with this. Yeah, so this is what I meant by it's going to prompt me for certain things throughout. But this is super nice, this documentation here, because it also has the commands, which we'll be diving into. But you can also extend this thing by using the Python API, which is really awesome. So aside from the built-in commands, modules can be loaded into the framework to add more functionality. So I think this is extremely powerful, and this is where you're really going to, it's going to come down to really customizing this thing and adding on to it, basically. And that is what makes a great C2 framework, is the customizability. One thing that I wanted to point out as well is just the simple definition of this, as noted by the creator here. It says, Havoc is a modern and malleable post-exploitation command and control framework. So malleable C2 is very much what this is based on, just like Cobalt Strike. And, you know, we have the concept of profiles and stuff like that, as we will get into here in a little bit. Let me just check back with this. All right. And it's still chugging along here. But, yeah, one thing that you can see is that there's a lot of customizability, and all the best red teamers, the APTs out there as well, certainly, they're not using default settings on their C2, right? Because that's the quickest way to get caught. The way to go is to customize your C2 as much as possible to make it more difficult for the defense, right? So with that being said, we will just wait on this thing to finish completing. I'm going to jump ahead in time by editing the video, and I'll see you guys once this is complete. All right, it has completed, and you see here, it wants me to do a restart. I'm going to try and avoid that unless I have to. And yeah, so I'm currently in the team server directory, right? We have these files here. You'll notice there's an install.sh and there's a make file as well. So those are the two things we need to do. But first, there are some dependencies that we're going to want to grab. So if we reconsult the wiki here, let me just scroll to the top of the page, go into the local installation. There's some dependencies. I want to make sure that I have these dependencies as well, since we are on a Debian-based system. Kali Linux is Debian-based. So I'm just going to run these commands here and then install this as well. So while that's going, the next set of dependencies that we need to pick up, I'll accept the default there, is, and like I said, you can build the client or team server first, doesn't matter, but we're going to want to pick up these Go dependencies that it needs as well. So yeah, you notice the theme here, a lot of stuff, prerequisite stuff that we need to have set up. And I'm just accepting defaults here again. So let's grab this stuff that Golang needs, because this tool, as you see here, it's actually written primarily in Golang, you know, mostly in Golang and in C++, right? So the next thing after that is just to utilize that make file to build the binary, and then that install.sh file will set up the C compiler that we'll need to build out the team server. All right, so that's good. So now once we're in the team server directory, we can simply run make, and that is going to build out our team server binary. All right, so now that that's finished, what you'll notice is there's this data folder here. If we go inside that, we can see this havoc.yaltl. If you're like me and have no idea what the heck YALTL file is, essentially it's kind of like almost like JSON. It's a markup language where you can define. This is your C2 profile. So I could edit this file. I could take a look at it, right? It sets options of how your Havoc C2 team server is actually going to run, right? And some other things as well, right? So you have the host, which it defaults to listening on all interfaces. And this is the default port here. Again, in a real scenario, you want to change all these defaults here. You don't want to use the default port. It's a quick way to get detected And then here's your paths to your compilers, which we just built with that install.sh script. And here is the operators. So it comes with a couple default ones. We'll just use the default for now, but we could just edit this file here to add our own custom users to our team server. And then it defaults to a 2-second sleep timer with the 20-second jitter. So basically, if you're familiar with jitter in C2s like Cobalt Strike, essentially there's randomization applied to the sleep. So the reason that you use the C2 in the first place, I've definitely explained this in other videos, but just to quickly touch on it here. And while I'm doing all this, let me just get the next download going, because this does take a minute. I'm going to go into the client now. Now we can build out the client since we have the team server. And all we need to do for this one is just run make in this directory. And this does take quite a bit of time. And you'll see a bunch of warnings and stuff come up on the screen. You don't really have to worry about those. It's going to build just fine, most likely. So to explain quickly what the point is of sleep and jitter and all of that is that the reason to use C2s in the first place, one of the reasons is that it is more stealthy than having a persistent reverse shell on a network, right? If you have a persistent TCP connection, that is a lot more noisy because it's constantly listening, right? And it's constantly available to be detected by the blue team or even their tooling, right? A lot of the endpoint detection and stuff like that could just easily detect it in an automated fashion. So it's much better to use something like a C2 framework where you have your agent running on the target machine, right, the compromised machine, and instead of having that persistent TCP connection, it is going to check back with our team server at a certain interval, right? That interval by default here would be 2 seconds. So every 2 seconds, it would check back with our team server to see if there's any tasks for it to run. If there is, it will go and run that task, come back with the output to our C2 server. Now, if we didn't have jitter, this would run every 2 seconds consistently. And anytime there's a pattern like that, those patterns make it easier for the defense, for the blue team to detect that pattern and then ultimately detect what we're doing here, which we don't want, obviously. So one way to obfuscate that is to add a concept of jitter, which is a randomization applied to those 2 seconds. So it could be, 18 seconds. It could be like 5 seconds. It could be anywhere up to 20 seconds of randomization applied, in which it would wait to check back with the team server for tasks, right? So that makes it a lot more random, a lot less predictable. There is no easy pattern to pick up there. And that is the point of using jitter. So let's just go back here. And this is what I was talking about. You'll see a lot of this text stuff on the screen. Don't worry about it. Everything should be building just fine. And this takes quite a while to complete. But what we can look at, I'm not going to really worry about editing any of this stuff here. Let me just copy the password so then I have it once we do go to set up the client. But what we can do is run the team server at this point, because after you run that make command, what you'll notice is this team server binary appears here, and you can consult the documentation for how to run. This is very similar to how you would run your team server in Cobalt Strike, which is another reason why I'd recommend using this. The look and feel of it is very much similar to Cobalt Strike. So I could just run this with profiles and this havoc.yaltl profile. We could create our own custom profile and have it load that as well, which in a real scenario, we'd want to do that for OPSEC. And we want to customize the heck out of this, basically. But let's just run this the way they recommended here. You see, I am currently running Havoc version 0.3, code name Hermit Purple. By the time you're watching this video, there might be a newer version out, but I would say the wiki should keep up to date, so you can just follow the instructions there if it's quite a bit different. But now this is running, and it's loaded our profile, it's used the cross compilation, and it's listening on all interfaces, port 456. Cool, so now we can set up our client once it finishes building out, and it has completed. So if I do an ls here, now I will see that it created this havoc binary. This is our client. So all we have to do is just run that. We don't need any arguments for this one. And that is going to pop up the UI here. I can name my session whatever. I'll call it havoc. And then the host, this is where I'm actually going to need to grab my IP address, because we'll just take the ETH0 interface. Remember, it is listening on all interfaces. We're going to go with the ETH0 one in this case and plug that in. And the port is 400.5.6. And we'll just log in with that Neo user. I think the password was password1234, all lowercase, I do believe. Yep, and now we are in. Awesome. So, yep, if you're familiar with Cobalt Strike, like I said, very similar look, but in my opinion, a lot sleeker, a lot better. One thing that a lot of people have gripes with on Cobalt Strike is the UI looks like it never really, it didn't age well. Let's just say that. This is a much more modern and sleek design of the Cobalt Strike UI, in my opinion. And so now the first thing we're going to do is go into view here, click on listeners. And here's where we can create our listener just like we would in any C2. So we'll click add, and we will give our listener a name. We'll call it Demon because the agents on the box are called demons. So we could call this listener Demon as well. And here's our options for payloads: HTTPS, HTTP, SMB, and external. We'll just go with the default HTTPS payload for now. And if we had multiple C2s, we could add them here. Multiple hosts, right? And we could actually rotate them in round robin. I believe this is the default in Cobalt Strike as well. But everything looks good here. We shouldn't really need to change anything from this. We could just hit save. And now we have our listener going. So now that we have our listener, the next thing to do is to generate that payload. So we go to attack and payload, and we can generate one. So it actually defaults to the name Demon. And architecture is x64, which I'm going to be running this against a 64-bit system, so we'll keep that. And it will default to 2-second sleep timer. And the sleep technique, this is what I was talking about earlier. It defaults to wait for single object EX. That is actually not using any kind of obfuscation or anything. Instead, I'm going to try out the one that C-Spider has created called Echo. But aside from that, I'll leave everything else default. We're going to inject into notepad.exe by default here. It is compiling source. And once it completes, it will ask us where we want to store that. Let's just check in over here with our Windows environment. And we're going to, here's some tests I was doing earlier. We're going to make sure that Windows Defender is turned off. Now, I had seen some videos out there where people were saying this bypasses Windows Defender. That was true at the time, but Windows Defender has now written some detections for this. I mean, it was only a matter of time that they would, right? But yeah, from my testing, I have found that Windows Defender was flagging and deleting the binary. Of course, you could just apply obfuscation and AV bypass techniques to the binary in order to get around that. But we're not going to worry about that in this video. We're just going to keep it nice and simple. So let's go into other locations, computer, opt, and havoc. We'll just store it. We'll create a file or a folder called like malicious, and that's where we'll just store all our binaries and stuff, I guess. Cool. So that is stored there. Next step is just to transfer the file. Now, of course, the way you do this is completely up to you, how you weaponize your payloads. We're not going to worry about that. Maybe you use like a malicious word macro. Maybe you do like a USB drop, email phishing campaign to a word macro, or even if you exploit a vulnerability. How you weaponize it and deliver it is up to you. But just for the sake of this tutorial here, I'm going to spin up an HTTP server and just do the transfer from that other machine. Let me grab my IP address. And I will get a command prompt going here. I'm going to go into the desktop And I'm just going to pull it down here. So if I go to use certutil, URL cache, split f HTTP this, and I will be grabbing daemon.exe. And let's see, let's make sure that we have everything set up correctly over here on this end. Okay, yeah, I didn't say port 80. That was the problem. That's fine. We'll just make it port 8000. So let me just add that real quick. And awesome, now we see daemon.exe pop up here. I'm just gonna double click that to run it. And if I go back to Havoc, right here, we see that we now have the connection right here. And we can actually change the view on this, which is pretty cool as well. So if you go into view, session view, we can switch it to graph view, which you might be familiar from Cobalt Strike. Looks very similar, right? And I have a number of cool things I can do. I could list the processes, go to File Explorer straight from here, or of course, interact with it to send it tasks. I'm going to hit interact. And if I type help down here, I can see what's available to me. This might look very familiar to you. This is the built-in stuff that most of the C2s have, right? Pretty much all of them. And actually, the built-in commands have a lot of what you would be familiar with from Cobalt Strike. They even have like an inline execute and stuff like that. Super cool. We can explore some of these, certainly. Now, one thing you might notice is the formatting looks a little bit wonky, and they explain this in the wiki page, I believe, but the reason is if you run this on Kali Linux, the terminal font is the reason for that. So in order to fix this, you would have to change your Kali terminal font to like one of the monospace fonts, and it should fix this issue. I don't really care too much. I'll just leave it as is. But we could also consult the wiki for more detailed information on some of these different commands. I'm going to run the check-in command first, which is going to give me back some useful information about the target. This would be kind of similar to running like a sysinfo command on a Windows box. You see here it comes back with a bunch of info, useful info, even related to the session as well. And data loot, this is the folder where it's going to install all of the, or download all of the loot that you gather. So if we take like a screenshot or something like that, if we download a file from the target system, that's where it will download it by default into that directory. But cool, we see we're dealing with the Windows 10 64-bit system. We have the host name information, the current user, and all of that stuff. So nice stuff to have here at a glance. Let's go ahead and avoid that one. And you could play around with the different commands and stuff that is available here. I would definitely recommend, once again, to check out the documentation, the wiki page. They have pretty in-depth explanations on the various modules and stuff that you can run in there. And yeah, just go around and just play around and explore with this stuff. And if you want to get into more technical content, especially related to red teaming, C2s, any of that stuff, I have that stuff on screen for you right now. I'll see you guys right over in those videos. Thanks for watching.